You're listening to an Airwave Media podcast.
Introducing the new Volvo XC90 with 7-seat versatility, Google built-in, and advanced safety features for all your precious cargo. The new Volvo XC90, designed for life. Visit volvocars.com/US to learn more.
Where's your playlist taking you? Down the highway? To the mountains? Or just into daydream mode while you're stuck in traffic? With over 4,000 hotels worldwide, Best Western is there to help you make the most of your getaway, wherever that is. Because the only thing better than a great playlist is a great trip. Life's the trip. Make the most of it at Best Western. Book direct and save at bestwestern.com.
Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another History of the Second World War interview. Today, I'm joined by Bruce Gudmundsson, creator of the Tactical Notebook on Substack and the author of several books on military history, including one I'm going to point out that was written several years ago called Stormtroop Tactics, which I call out specifically because I read the book back in the history of the Great War years, and I have it back on my to-read list for another upcoming project. So, Bruce, welcome to the podcast, and I'm going to try a new thing on this interview. What is something that keeps you interested in history after all your years of studying and writing about it?
Oh, that's a great question. First of all, thank you for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here. There's always something new. There are always lots of surprises. The things you think you know turn out to be, if not different, more nuanced. So you could always go further and further.
Yes, and on the Tactical Notebook, you often go quite deep into some topics for sure.
Yes. No. There's a lot of really good military history out there, and so I'm really looking to provide something that readers really can't find elsewhere.
And so when we were talking about the subject for this interview, you've done tons of writing over the years. There's a whole list of topics we could probably chat for roughly an hour about. But you made a proposal that we talk about what you call the paradoxical impact of motorization. And anytime somebody wants to talk about the paradoxical impact of anything, I'm probably going to want to talk about it. So could you walk me through what you mean by the idea of the paradoxical impact of motorization?
Yes, there are. I should have said paradoxical impacts, right? There are many paradoxes. One of them, the first one, is that motorization follows a previous revolution in transportation, and in particular in military transportation, and that is a double revolution that starts with the use of the steam engine, the use of railroads and steamships. But that great increase in, excuse the expression, horsepower makes it much easier for armies to keep and use horses. So the horses eat like horses, about 10 kilos a day. That's my figure I got from actually Baden-Powell, founder of the Boy Scouts. And he was a cavalry officer, wrote a little manual that's very, very handy. And so horses, if you want them to work, you have to feed them. If you've got grass, they can spend all day grazing, but then they can't work. So in order to put military horses to use, you have to provide them with food, food and water. It's another a similar poundage of water, again about 10 liters, 10 quarts of water, and then you have to clean up after them if they're not moving. So there's a lot of work there. The steam engine makes that a whole lot easier. So you see, after the introduction of the steam engine, a great increase in the number of horses that armies can manage, and particularly the hardest working horses, which are the artillery horses. So you get you essentially double the amount of field artillery in the second half of the 19th century available to first class armies in the field, and that is not just the horses that are pulling the guns, but also the horses that are pulling the wagons that are delivering the ammunition. So by the time you get to the First World War, armies have a lot more in the way of horses. They don't have lot more in the way of cavalry, proportionally speaking, but the bottleneck there with cavalry is not horses, but cavalrymen. Take a long time to train. Um, General Haig, whom you know from your podcast on the Great War, before World War, about 1910 or so, 1912, um, writes a memorandum on, or a study actually, on the training of cavalry, and says, in peacetime it takes 12 months to train a private, a horse soldier. I mean, that's just his individual training. In wartime, we can compress that to 10 months. It takes, compare that to maybe 3 months for the individual training of an infantryman. So you really need long service soldiers. This is why the French cavalry is so bad in 1914. They don't have the long service cavalrymen that the Germans or the British have. So anyway, so in World War I, we start off with a very high proportion of horses. Railroads and increasingly motor transport allows them to move, and then the things get even more complicated because we talk a lot about the machine gun, and its kissing cousin, the trench mortar. All sorts of heavy weapons for the infantry, and those have to be moved. And their ammunition has to be moved. So now the infantry needs a lot of horses. So whereas, in 1914, not counting the machine guns, an infantry company could make do with a couple of wagons, right? One wagon for all the extraneous gear, and one for the Germans call this word, the goulash kanone, right? The field kitchen, the rolling kitchen, that's cooking the stew while it moves. But then you start having to have like machine guns and these little grenade launchers and other weapons like that, and now the infantry starts needing more wagons and more horses. And this I think is one of the unsung stories about the great German offensives of the spring of 1918, and about the German classification of divisions. They have various categories of division, and we tend to think of the assault division, Sturmdivision, as these are the guys who look like Arnold Schwarzenegger, and but in fact, what distinguishes those from other divisions is they have a full proportion of horses. Germany suffers from a great shortage of horses during the course of the First World War, and they really can't import them. The Entente powers, particularly the British Empire, can import horses from Canada, Argentina, from America, Australia, and lots of them. The Germans can't do that. So the Germans suffer greatly from a shortage of horses in 1918. It's also why so many artillery pieces are captured. These trophies. Recently on the Plains of Abraham, and I should have been thinking 18th century thoughts, but instead I was looking at these German artillery pieces captured by the Canadian forces in World War I, and reminded, how all of these the Germans are having to abandon their artillery because they can't move it as they retreat in the last phase of the war on the Western Front. So there is, as motorization is beginning, there is this increase in both the demand for horses and in some cases the supply for horses. Motorization happens first in the supply echelons, and that's entirely uncontroversial. No one ever argues against that, and that happens almost invisibly. Trucks are so much more efficient. So you compare, let's say, a standard World War I truck has a capacity of about 3 tons. That's so 2 drivers are moving 3 tons. To move the same tonnage, you need 3 general service wagons. This is the British standard military 4-horse wagon, can carry about a ton. So you go from 6 drivers down to 3. You go down from maybe 100 meters of road space to 20 meters of road space. All sorts of great efficiencies. And the beauty of motor transport is that it can stay still. So if you have a bunch of horses and they're not working, yes, they eat a little bit less, but you have to feed them, you have to water them, you have to care for them, and you have to clean up after them. And again, that figure of 10 kilos of food and 10 liters or 10 kilos of water, most of that's coming out the other end as well. So you need a lot of people to muck out the stables or do the equivalent thereof, and that just takes an enormous amount of manpower. In the First World War, most of the men in a typical field artillery battery are not working the guns. They are taking care of the horses. And when you motorize a battery, you get about I'll use the French example. French like to have 4 guns in a battery. But when they motorize, they go up to 6 guns because you can turn horse handlers, people who care for horses, into people who aim and feed the guns. Huge increase in efficiency. Another thing that motorization does for you is that it enables amphibious operations. So that horses don't like to go to sea, and they're very difficult to handle. They take up a lot of space, and again, when they're on the ship, you've got all the problems of the stationary horse to deal with, and so you have some, shall we say, short-range amphibious operations, like the German attack on the island of Saaremaa, also known as Uzel, in the Gulf of Riga in the fall of 1917. But that is a amphibious operation launched from a nearby shore. It's launched from Kurland. It's launched from the coast of Latvia. So the horses are only at sea for a couple of days. And even then, the Germans have to really cut down on the number of horses with the expeditionary force, and to replace them largely with bicycles. So that's another aspect is that again, the beauty of bicycles. If you have decent roads or suitable terrain, bicycles don't eat. And again, you can park them and they come back. Horses, if you're going into combat and you're riding into combat, someone's going to take care of those horses. So every 4th man is a horse holder, which reduces the firepower of unit by 25%. That's somebody not carrying a carbine. So you get all these little efficiencies with motorization. This is also why the U.S. Marine Corps embraces motorization. Again, quietly, without fanfare. I don't think everyone's ever written a study on this, but it happens without any discussion. I mean, there's no arguments in the pages of the Marine Corps Gazette saying, no, we need to have more horses. So that's something. You think about the Operation Torch in North Africa, right? Particularly the unsung part, which is the landings in Morocco. Those units that landed 35,000 American soldiers, they embarked from the east coast of the U.S., right? And then they crossed the Atlantic, and then they you couldn't do that with horses, but you put a jeep, on a Liberty ship, it's happy to stay there until you move it. It's very, 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 very patient. Other paradoxes of motorization. Again, this is a well-known story. Is the dependence of the German army of World War II on horses, and that's a function of not having gasoline, right? I mean, not having fuel. It's the lack of petroleum and having to reserve that for special occasions. So, particularly the things that which there are no substitutes like like aircraft. And again, the great increase in heavy weapons that happens in the First World War and then the interwar period, where every German infantry regiment has its own artillery. It's what the Germans call infantry artillery, which is these direct fire pieces, some 75 millimeters, some 150 millimeters. That's shooting a 45 kilo shell. All of that is horse drawn. When they go to the Eastern Front, they actually get a bit of a bonus because there are these Russian ponies that don't eat as much and can handle the cold, and those get conscripted into the German army very, 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 very quickly.
This podcast is brought to you by Carvana. Buying a car shouldn't eat up your week. That's why Carvana made it convenient. Car buying that fits around your life, not the other way around. You can get pre-qualified for an auto loan in just a couple of minutes and browse thousands of quality car options, all within your terms, all online, all on your schedule. Turn car buying into a few clicks and not a full week's endeavor. Finance and buy your car at your convenience on Carvana. Financing subject to credit approval. Additional terms and conditions may apply.
On WhatsApp, no one can see or hear your personal messages. Whether it's a voice call, message, or sending a password. To WhatsApp, it's all just this. So whether you're sharing the streaming password in the family chat or trading those late-night voice messages that could basically become a podcast, your personal messages stay between you, your friends, and your family. No one else. Not even us. WhatsApp. Message privately with everyone.
So thinking about like kind of where we started with that, right? Where the railways and kind of the further away from the battlefield motorization that's happening to support more horses, to support more men. Like, armies were getting much larger during that late 1800s, early 1900s period as well. It's interesting to hear kind of how, once the war starts, both sides start to kind of run out of horses. Like even the Allies at some point, don't have this endless supply of horses to bring in. And it certainly impacted the Germans a lot more. And I think that the thing that always shocked me about, like, I don't really know horses. I'm not a horse guy, right? But reading about the First World War and what was happening was kind of the wastage of horses, not because they were, being neglectful of them or anything like a movie cliche or anything like that. But, a horse does not have an indefinite lifespan, right? In that kind of hard labor situation at the front, especially when food for the Germans, the fodder that's being provided maybe isn't as plentiful as you would want it to be. And so the number of horses starts to become a real problem, quite quickly.
Yes, and the horses, when the horse is working, and I'm talking particularly about a European style, or North American style horse, it wants to eat oats or some other grain, so that about half of its diet is high quality grain, and that's 5 kilos, or 10 pounds roughly. That's a lot of bread that's not getting made. That's going into the horse. Horses can't hide from artillery. Right? They just stand out there, and they're vulnerable. They're very fragile creatures in many respects. And in World War I, you have pretty well developed veterinary science, but you also have in some armies a shortage of people who know how to take care of horses. So that this is a problem. The British Army has a problem with a society that is running out of men who know how to take care of horses. So they have to have a special program to train blacksmiths and farriers and wheelwrights and harness makers and people in all those trades that are needed to deal with horses. They have no shortage of mechanics. The French are in the opposite position. They have this in your programs about Verdun, you mentioned the Voie Sacrée, right? The sacred route, the sacred road, just full of trucks. There is a huge program in the French army to train truck drivers, because again, French society is still largely rural. It's animal-based agriculture, which produces marvelous cheese, but doesn't produce people who know how to handle machines. So it's interesting to this imbalance between skills and what your army needs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that you mentioned during the 1918 offensive, the Germans kind of concentrating their horses. The and still not having enough. In one of the articles I read that you wrote, you were talking about what you mentioned earlier, where because of lack of transport, because of lack of horses, they had to leave things behind, right? Things that they would have typically used in an offensive, like your trench mortars or your heavy weapons and things like that. So it's interesting to hear that. Like, I'm sure they were stripping horses from all kinds of other units, making them much less capable of responding to the American and British and French attack right afterwards, just to try and make any kind of offensive movement happen, utilizing the mobility that the horses provided.
Yes, in the German army in the First World War, for that final offensive, the units on the Eastern Front are yes, they're giving up their young men, they're also giving up their horses. So, and there's also a lot, if you look at sort of German diplomacy, local diplomacy in 1918, they're putting a lot of pressure, for example, on the Ukrainian independence movement. Please supply us, with horses. A lot of pressure on Austria-Hungary to provide horses. So it really is it requires a huge effort.
Yeah, and I wonder, like, thinking about the interwar period as well, the well-known story of how important the horse was to the German army during the Second World War. Do you know if there were any programs to, like, breed more horses? Because I mean, again, I'm not an expert in equine history, but we're probably past the point of peak horse at that point, right, within society, where society is trending away from horses, and suddenly the German military is once again expanding and once again needing more horses. Like, do the horses exist to make that happen?
That is a very interesting question. I've not seen much about that. I know that the bottleneck again for the German army, certainly in the early part of World War II, is the trained cavalrymen. Now, part of that is the interwar army is the army of leaders, and a lot of people who spent a dozen years of the interwar period as privates and corporals and sergeants of cavalry. They end up in assault gun units, and they end up in tanks, and they end up particularly in the armored infantry. So there is a desire to provide. So for example, they would like to provide every infantry regiment with a platoon or more of horse cavalry just for local reconnaissance. And what they have to do is pull guys out of the other infantry units in order to staff that. So the bottleneck isn't the riding horses, but and I know that they pulled. There's actually a whole book about the horses of the Wehrmacht, and written by one of my colleagues at the Marine Corps University. And I will remember his name in a in a moment. I ran into him last year. He's doing well, but there is, and that actually goes into horse procurement. A lot of that's coming out of Hungary.
Okay,
and and that's both for the transport horses and the riding horses. The other thing that happens is that as artillery gets larger, there is demand for even larger horses. So when the Germans start attaching 150 millimeter howitzers to field formations, this happens in roughly 1900 or so. The complaints are about the elephants that are needed to pull those pieces, and that's one of the things that happens in the as soon as they can, the Germans motorize those much heavier pieces. So again, the German motorization is very, very selective, and usually very, very concentrated.
Yeah, and you also mentioned kind of trying to spread out horses amongst the infantry units. One of the things that's kind of surprised me as a person who was recently researching and writing about the campaign in Poland, right, was that how useful horses were for things you might not think about, like reconnaissance, right? Like the importance of having a man on a horse that can go look over that hill really quick and come back and let you know if he saw anything. Those kinds of situations were very common, especially early in the war.
Yes, no, and again, one can argue, and this argument has been made, that the Germans could have used more cavalry. Certainly in that campaign. Again, we have the cliche of the Polish lancer trying to lance a tank. And I think we all realize that's a myth now. It's still very much part of the that meme is still repeated every once in a while. In the initial phases of the Polish campaign, there's this great belt of woods that between the Germans and the Poles, and the German tanks get ambushed. There's one German tank regiment that gets torn apart by Polish cavalry. Now the cavalry is equipped with anti-tank guns, good Bofors anti-tank guns, but the tanks just basically go into the woods blind. They'd been much better if some horsemen had gone before them in the invasion of the Soviet Union in Barbarossa. You have the problem of the fully mechanized forces, the fully motorized forces. They go on ahead, and they make incredible progress, and the infantry is hard pressed to catch up with them. The infantry divisions, the muscle-powered divisions, and they make up for this by concentrating what little motor transport they have to make what they call a Vorausabteilung, an advanced detachment. And this is the anti-tank battalion and the reconnaissance battalion. But that's a tiny proportion of the strength of the division. And there's these great big gaps between the gasoline-powered, the fuel-powered, petroleum-powered forces and the muscle-powered forces. And to have cavalry or mounted infantry or big formations of bicycle troops to fill that gap would have been very, very handy.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess the interesting thing is like the Soviets on the Eastern Front do end up using cavalry, at least in the early parts of the campaign, to some success, right? Like they have kind of the more traditional kind of cavalry units that launch attacks and end up behind the German lines for a little bit and cause all kinds of havoc, whereas the Germans just don't really have anything that's equivalent to those
No,
formations.
no, yeah, right. And the Soviets are benefiting from their own experience of the Russian Civil War, um, and this Russian cavalry tradition that really goes back to the Napoleonic Wars. It's interesting that the Russians also studied in great detail the American Civil War and these great big cavalry raids that were enabled, ironically, by very often by steamships. Um, Steamboats coming down the river to deliver the fodder that allows these great big forces of cavalry to be assembled. So the Russians looked at them or looked at them. In fact, the word raid in Russian means that kind of operation. It's not, we tend to think of a commando raid or something like that, but the word raid in Russian means this great big force of cavalry going on a long journey through, or usually behind, an enemy army. It did that to great, with considerable success in 1877 in the Russo-Turkish War. So the Soviets are sitting on top of that tradition.
Yeah, you mentioned. I just thought of when you were mentioning the American Civil War and steamships and things like that. Like the relationship, kind of thinking back to the beginning of the conversation, with how horses are used. It's like horses end up being like the last mile transportation for like supplies and things during the First World War. But the growth of railways enable more supplies to get to the front for horses and manpower, which allows for more manpower to be at the front, which requires more horses to get the supplies there, which requires more supplies to get to the end of the railhead. And you have different situations during the Second World War, particularly on the Eastern Front, where supplies are such a huge deal, right? Like the distances involved are so massive. It's interesting to think about how all of that plays together in terms of making a successful sort of military campaign.
Yes, yeah, no, and again, it's not a straight line. It's not, there's a classic essay by Edward Katzenbach, published in the 50s, about the irrationality of soldiers holding onto horses, and he's really looking at the U.S. Army because again, the most the American love affair with the automobile happens very early, and and yet the U.S. Army really doesn't put the horse aside until right on the very eve of the Second World War. But there are good reasons for that, and one of them is the mission of watching the southern border, the border with Mexico. One of them is the mission of defending the Philippines, which doesn't have a lot in the way of roads. And again, paradoxically, what the motor vehicles do is they enable the horse-drawn units to do a whole lot of things they couldn't have done otherwise.
Anytime there are discussions about technology and innovation in history, particularly military technologies and military histories, there's a tendency to armchair general decisions. How do you think we should look at those decisions?
I very much. I watched in preparation for this. I watched your talk at an intelligence speech conference a couple of years ago, and I really like your philosophy of history. This emphasis on I call this the prospective perspective.
Okay.
Right. Realizing that you're reading history, you're sitting there, you've got a nice cup of coffee, there's a nice fire in the fireplace. There's a cat curled up at your feet, and
Hmm.
you're reading about this. You say, "Oh, how could they have been so stupid?
Yep.
How could they
Yep.
not have known?" And yet we have the benefit of hindsight. We have the benefit of comfort. Um, so I think when it comes to things like motorization, there is this Whig prejudice, right? Of progress is linear. Everyone can see progress. The only people who don't see the progress are troglodytes, right? That is Colonel Blimp, um, as opposed to every time there's a new technology, there's trade-offs, and uh, more than that, the new technology can ironically enable the old technology. And the new technology can also create opportunities for the old technology. Um, and if you doubt this, go back to the 90s and the predictions of the paperless office.
Still a lot of paper in there.
Still a whole lot of paper out there.
It's interesting. I've always found it really interesting when you know people talk about motorization or mechanization, or they criticize various armies for not getting tanks fast enough is a very common thing, while at the same time, like the percentage of any study of the Eastern Front and how much of that study is spent on how the Germans had no gas,
Yes,
right?
yes.
It's always interesting to see those two viewpoints, often very close to one another, right? Where it's people will it's very easy to say, oh, why didn't you get to tanks faster? Why didn't you get to fast tanks faster or better tanks faster? Why didn't you put more into motorized infantry or trucks or these sorts of things? Well, at the same time, like, you have to consider that you have to have the infrastructure and the supplies for those things. You have to be able to get the fuel forward or they're useless. And if you want a great example of that, just look at everything that happened in North Africa from like 1940 to 1943. It's a story of armies that want to use the latest technology. They want to be motorized and mechanized, but they cannot get fuel forward fast enough to really support those kinds of operations.
Yes, and my favorite story actually about that in North Africa is the German use of dhows, of these traditional coastal vessels, to deliver fuel to the fast moving Africa Corps. Yeah, there's always this combination of old and new, and so I think again, this kind of straight line thinking is not useful for military folks.